The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the crowded military mess hall, casting harsh shadows across the sea of uniformed personnel grabbing their evening meals. The clatter of trays and the hum of conversation filled the air as soldiers, sailors, and airmen moved through the serving line with practiced efficiency. Among them, Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from 6 years of military service, 3 combat deployments, and countless challenges overcome. Maria had always known she was different from many of her peers. Growing up in a small Texas border town, she had been raised by her grandmother after her parents died in a car accident when she was 12. Her abuela had instilled in her the values of hard work, respect, and never backing down from what was right. These lessons had served Maria well during her time in the Army, where she had earned recognition as a skilled communications specialist and natural leader. Tonight felt different, though. Maria could sense the tension in the air as she made her way through the mess hall with her tray of standard military fare. She had been dealing with increased hostility from a group of male soldiers who seemed to take issue with her recent promotion to staff sergeant. The promotion had come after she had successfully coordinated communications during a complex joint operation that had saved several lives. But some of her male counterparts viewed it as preferential treatment rather than earned recognition. As Maria found an empty table near the back of the mess hall, she noticed the familiar group of 5 soldiers who had been making her life difficult for the past several weeks. They were led by Sergeant First Class Tony Matthews, a career soldier with a reputation for being old school and resistant to change. Matthews had made it clear that he believed women had no place in combat roles, and he seemed to take Maria's success as a personal affront to his worldview. The group had started with subtle harassment, making comments just loud enough for her to hear, questioning her qualifications in front of other soldiers, and creating an atmosphere of hostility wherever she went. Maria had initially tried to ignore their behavior, hoping it would fade as they became accustomed to working with female soldiers. However, their actions had become increasingly bold and confrontational over the past few days. As Maria began eating her meal, she noticed Matthews and his group standing up from their table across the mess hall. Instead of heading toward the exit as she had hoped, they began walking directly toward her table. The background noise of the mess hall seemed to fade as other soldiers began to notice the approaching confrontation. Maria felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to continue eating normally, unwilling to show any sign of intimidation. Matthews reached her table first, his imposing 6-foot frame casting a shadow across her meal. The other 4 soldiers spread out around the table, effectively surrounding her position. The tactical nature of their positioning was not lost on Maria, who recognized it as a deliberate intimidation technique designed to make her feel trapped and vulnerable. Well, Matthews began, his voice carrying clearly across the now quieter mess hall. Look who thinks she deserves to eat with the real soldiers. His comment drew snickers from his companions and uncomfortable glances from other personnel in the vicinity. Maria looked up calmly, meeting his gaze with steady eyes that betrayed none of the anxiety she felt building in her chest. I'm just trying to eat my dinner, Sergeant, Maria replied evenly, her voice controlled and professional despite the obvious provocation. She had learned long ago that maintaining composure in difficult situations was often the best defense against bullies and aggressors. Just trying to eat your dinner, Matthews repeated mockingly. Maybe you should be eating in the women's quarters instead of taking up space where real warriors gather. The comment was clearly designed to provoke a reaction, and Maria could feel the eyes of dozens of other soldiers watching the interaction unfold. Maria continued eating, refusing to engage with the bait. She knew that responding emotionally would only escalate the situation and potentially give Matthews ammunition to use against her later. However, her silence seemed to frustrate him rather than discourage his behavior. I'm talking to you, Sergeant, Matthews continued, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. The least you could do is show some respect when your superiors are addressing you. The irony of his demand for respect, while clearly showing none himself, was not lost on the watching crowd. One of Matthews' companions, a corporal named Jake Stevens, decided to join the harassment. Maybe she can't hear us over the sound of her own crying, he said with a cruel laugh. I heard female soldiers cry a lot when things get tough in the field. Maria felt anger beginning to build inside her, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had faced enemy fire, coordinated complex military operations under extreme pressure, and earned the respect of commanding officers through her competence and dedication. She would not allow a group of insecure bullies to diminish her accomplishments or drive her away from where she belonged. You know what I think? Matthews continued, leaning closer to Maria's table. I think someone made a mistake when they gave you those stripes. I think maybe it's time for you to find a new career path, something more suitable for someone like you. The mess hall had grown significantly quieter as more soldiers became aware of the confrontation taking place. Some looked uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, while others seemed curious about how the situation would resolve itself. Maria noticed that several female soldiers had stopped eating and were watching with obvious concern for her safety and dignity. Maria finally looked up from her meal, her dark eyes meeting Matthew's hostile stare. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried clearly in the hushed atmosphere of the mess hall. Sergeant Matthews, I earned my promotion through merit, just like any other soldier. I've served my country with honor for 6 years, and I intend to continue doing so regardless of your personal opinions about women in the military. Her measured response seemed to anger Matthews further. Merit? He scoffed loudly. What merit? Being pretty enough to catch some officers' attention? We all know how these things really work. The accusation was both insulting and completely unfounded, but it served to further humiliate Maria in front of her peers. The atmosphere in the mess hall had become electric with tension. Several soldiers had stopped eating entirely, some appearing ready to intervene if the situation escalated further. Others looked away uncomfortably, unwilling to get involved, but clearly disturbed by what they were witnessing. The harassment had crossed the line from simple hazing into something much more serious and potentially dangerous. Matthews reached down and knocked over Maria's water glass, sending liquid spilling across the table and onto her uniform. Oops, he said with mock innocence. Looks like you need to be more careful, Sergeant. The deliberate nature of the action made it clear that this was no accident. Maria stood up slowly, water dripping from her uniform onto the mess hall floor. She was acutely aware that every eye in the room was now focused on her reaction to this escalating harassment. She could feel the weight of expectations from the female soldiers watching, knowing that her response would be discussed and analyzed long after this confrontation ended. That's enough, Maria said firmly, her military training evident in her posture and tone. Despite being outnumbered and clearly in a vulnerable position, she refused to be intimidated into submission. Your behavior is unprofessional and inappropriate. I suggest you return to your table and finish your meal. Matthews laughed harshly. Or what? You'll report me to your buddies in command? Good luck with that, sweetheart. No one's going to believe your word over mine, and for witnesses who saw you being clumsy with your drink. The threat was clear, and Maria realized that this confrontation had moved beyond simple harassment into something that could seriously impact her military career. False accusations and coordinated lies from multiple soldiers could indeed cause significant problems for her, regardless of the truth of what had actually occurred. Stevens stepped closer, invading Maria's personal space in a deliberately intimidating manner. Maybe it's time for you to learn your place around here, he said menacingly. Some lessons are better taught than explained. The implied threat of physical violence hung heavy in the air. Maria's training kicked in as she assessed her tactical situation. 5 opponents, limited escape routes, dozens of witnesses of varying loyalty and reliability. She was skilled in hand-to-hand combat and confident in her abilities, but the odds were clearly not in her favor. Just as the situation seemed to be reaching a critical point, Maria noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere of the mess hall. The background conversations had stopped entirely, and an almost reverent silence had fallen over the room. Matthews and his group were so focused on their harassment that they failed to notice the shift in mood around them. Maria's eyes moved past her harassers to see what had captured the attention of everyone else in the mess hall. Standing near the entrance, having just entered the dining facility, was a figure that commanded immediate respect and recognition from everyone present. Even from a distance, Maria could see the distinctive insignia and bearing that marked this newcomer as someone very special indeed. The man was tall and powerfully built, with the kind of presence that seemed to fill a room simply by being in it. His uniform was immaculate, and even without being able to see the specific details of his decorations, Maria could tell from the reaction of everyone around her that this was someone of significant importance and reputation. Matthews was still talking, oblivious to the change in atmosphere. "I think it's time we taught this little girl what happens when she tries to play with the big boys," he was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the now silent mess hall. Maria watched as the mysterious figure began moving through the mess hall with purposeful steps. Other soldiers stepped aside to create a clear path, their faces showing a mixture of respect and anticipation. Whoever this person was, his presence had completely changed the dynamic of the situation. The man's movement was fluid and confident, the walk of someone comfortable with command and accustomed to being in control of difficult situations. As he drew closer, Maria could begin to make out more details of his appearance and bearing. This was clearly a man who had seen significant action and earned the deep respect of his peers through both skill and character. Matthews finally began to notice that something had changed. The absolute silence of the mess hall was impossible to ignore, and he started to turn around to see what had captured everyone's attention. His companions were also beginning to sense that their moment of perceived dominance was about to be interrupted by an unexpected development. As the approaching figure drew closer, Maria felt a surge of hope mixed with curiosity about what was about to unfold. The timing of this person's arrival seemed almost providential, coming at the exact moment when her situation had become most dangerous and humiliating. Whether this would lead to intervention or simply provide another witness to her harassment remained to be seen. The mess hall remained frozen in anticipation as the drama continued to unfold, with Maria surrounded and facing an uncertain immediate future, while a mysterious and clearly respected figure approached with unknown intentions. The next few minutes would prove to be pivotal not just for Maria's immediate safety, but for her entire military career and personal sense of dignity and belonging in the service she had chosen to dedicate her life to. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be remembered and discussed throughout the base for years to come, though none of the participants yet understood the full significance of what was about to transpire in the harsh fluorescent lighting of that military mess hall on what had started as just another ordinary evening. The approaching figure moved with the fluid precision of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of controlled movement under pressure. As he drew closer to the confrontation surrounding Maria, the details of his appearance became increasingly clear to everyone in the mess hall. The man wore the uniform of a Navy SEAL, and the array of ribbons and insignia across his chest told the story of a career filled with extraordinary service and achievement. Master Chief Petty Officer Daniel Ghost Morrison was a legend within the special operations community. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall with graying temples that spoke to his 24 years of service, Morrison had participated in some of the most classified and dangerous missions of the past 2 decades. His call sign, Ghost, had been earned through his uncanny ability to appear and disappear during operations, moving through hostile territory with an almost supernatural stealth that had saved countless lives and completed impossible missions. Morrison's reputation extended far beyond his operational capabilities. He was known throughout the military community as a man of uncompromising integrity and fierce loyalty to those who served with honor. Stories of his interventions on behalf of junior personnel facing unfair treatment had become the stuff of legend, though Morrison himself never spoke of such incidents. He believed that protecting those who could not protect themselves was simply part of the duty that came with rank and experience. As Morrison continued his approach toward the confrontation, his experienced eyes quickly assessed the tactical situation. 5 men surrounding 1 woman, the body language of intimidation and aggression, the obvious discomfort of the watching crowd. Having led men in combat for over 2 decades, Morrison could read group dynamics and recognize trouble with the same instinct that had kept him alive in hostile territory around the world. Matthews finally completed his turn to see what had captured the attention of the entire mess hall. When his eyes fell upon the approaching SEAL Master Chief, the color drained from his face with remarkable speed. Even someone as arrogant and self-important as Matthews recognized the reputation and authority of Master Chief Morrison. The ribbons on Morrison's chest included combat decorations that Matthews could only dream of earning, and the quiet confidence in the man's bearing made it clear that this was someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Oh shit," Stevens whispered under his breath, recognizing the approaching figure. The other members of Matthews' group began to shift uncomfortably, suddenly, aware that their moment of perceived power was about to be challenged by someone whose authority was unquestionable and whose reputation for decisive action was well known throughout the base. Morrison stopped directly behind Matthews, close enough that the sergeant could feel the SEAL's presence without physical contact. When Morrison spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had commanded respect in the world's most dangerous places. The tone was conversational, almost friendly, but there was an underlying steel that made it clear this was not a request for information. "Gentlemen," Morrison began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent mess hall. "I couldn't help but notice that you seem to be having some kind of gathering around this table. Perhaps one of you could explain to me what's so important that it requires 5 grown men to surround one soldier during her meal." Matthews turned slowly to face Morrison, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. Up close, the SEAL Master Chief was even more imposing, with the kind of presence that came from years of making life and death decisions under extreme pressure. The man's eyes held a depth that spoke of experiences most people could barely imagine. "Master Chief," Matthews managed to say, his voice noticeably less steady than it had been moments before. "We were just having a conversation with Sergeant Rodriguez. Nothing official, just some friendly discussion between colleagues." Morrison's expression remained neutral, but Maria could see something dangerous flickering behind his calm exterior. The Master Chief had clearly observed enough of the situation to understand exactly what kind of friendly discussion had been taking place. His next words carried the weight of absolute authority. "Interesting," Morrison replied thoughtfully. "From my vantage point, it appeared more like 5 soldiers intimidating one of their peers. But perhaps my eyes are playing tricks on me." The statement was delivered with the kind of deadly quiet that experienced soldiers recognized as far more dangerous than any shouting or displays of anger. Stevens, apparently not reading the situation as clearly as his companions, decided to speak up. "Master Chief, with all due respect, this is really just an internal matter between Army personnel. I'm not sure it requires any outside intervention." The silence that followed Stevens' comment was so profound that Maria could hear the humming of the refrigeration units in the kitchen area. Every person in the mess hall understood that the corporal had just made a serious tactical error by effectively dismissing the Master Chief's involvement in the situation. Morrison turned his attention to Stevens with the slow, deliberate movement of a predator focusing on potential prey. When he spoke, his voice remained conversational, but the underlying threat was unmistakable. "Corporal Stevens, isn't it? I believe you're suggesting that I should mind my own business while I witness what appears to be harassment and intimidation of a fellow service member. Is that an accurate understanding of your position?" Stevens' face went pale as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Challenging a Master Chief's authority, especially one with Morrison's reputation, was career suicide under the best of circumstances. Doing so while engaged in questionable behavior made the situation exponentially worse. "No, Master Chief," Stevens stammered. "I didn't mean to suggest. I was just saying that." Morrison raised a hand slightly, a gesture that immediately silenced Stevens' stammering explanation. The Master Chief's attention then shifted to Maria, his expression softening slightly as he addressed her directly. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I believe it is," Morrison asked, his voice taking on a more respectful tone. "Are you being treated with the respect and courtesy that every service member deserves?" Maria looked up at Morrison, seeing in his eyes a genuine concern and understanding that she had not expected. Here was someone who clearly recognized the situation for what it was and was prepared to take action on her behalf. After weeks of facing harassment and intimidation largely alone, the intervention felt almost surreal. "Master Chief," Maria began carefully, aware that her next words could have significant consequences for everyone involved. "These soldiers have been expressing their opinions about women serving in combat roles. They seem to believe that my promotion was undeserved." Morrison nodded slowly, his expression growing more serious as he processed Maria's diplomatic but clear explanation. His years of experience had taught him to read between the lines of such careful statements, and he understood exactly what kind of opinions had been expressed. "I see," Morrison replied thoughtfully. "And how long has this exchange of opinions been taking place?" "Several weeks, Master Chief," Maria answered honestly. "It's been escalating recently." Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of his growing anger at the situation. He turned back to Matthews and his group, his expression hardening as he prepared to address the real issue at hand. "Gentlemen," Morrison began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Let me share something with you that might help clarify your understanding of the situation. Sergeant Rodriguez has served her country with distinction for 6 years. She has completed 3 combat deployments, during which she coordinated communications that saved American lives. Her promotion was based on merit, competence, and outstanding service." Matthews opened his mouth as if to object, but Morrison's raised hand stopped him before he could speak. "I'm not finished," Morrison continued, his voice growing colder. "Furthermore, Sergeant Rodriguez has earned the respect of every officer and enlisted person who has served alongside her in combat. That includes several SEALs who worked with her unit during joint operations in Afghanistan." The revelation that Morrison had personal knowledge of Maria's service record sent a shock wave through the group of harassers. They had assumed they were dealing with just another female soldier trying to prove herself in a man's world. The reality that she had earned recognition from elite special operations personnel completely undermined their narrative of undeserved advancement. Morrison stepped closer to Matthews, invading the sergeant's personal space in much the same way that Matthews had intimidated Maria. "Now, Sergeant Matthews, perhaps you could explain to me why you and your companions feel qualified to question the judgment of combat veterans who have actually served alongside Sergeant Rodriguez." Matthews found himself in an impossible position. He could hardly admit that his harassment was based on nothing more than prejudice and insecurity. At the same time, he could not credibly challenge the assessment of special operations personnel who had first-hand experience with Maria's capabilities. "Master Chief," Matthews began weakly, "we were just concerned about maintaining standards." "Standards?" Morrison interrupted, his voice sharp with contempt. "What standards are those, Sergeant? The standard that says 5 men should surround 1 woman during her meal? The standard that allows soldiers to question promotions based on gender rather than merit? Perhaps you could enlighten me about these standards you're so concerned with maintaining." The group of harassers found themselves completely outmaneuvered by Morrison's systematic dismantling of their position. Every excuse they might offer was being preemptively destroyed by the Master Chief's relentless logic and obvious command of the facts. Morrison's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "Let me be absolutely clear about something, gentlemen. Harassment of fellow service members is not tolerated in any branch of the military. Intimidation based on gender is both unprofessional and illegal, and questioning the competence of proven combat veterans based on prejudice rather than facts is an insult to everyone who has ever worn the uniform." The mess hall remained absolutely silent as Morrison delivered his devastating assessment of the situation. Other soldiers watched with a mixture of fascination and horror as the legendary SEAL systematically destroyed the reputation and credibility of Matthews and his companions. Stevens made another tactical error by attempting to defend their actions. "Master Chief, we weren't trying to harass anyone. We were just expressing our honest concerns about integration policies." Morrison turned to Stevens with the expression of someone who had just heard the most ridiculous statement imaginable. "Corporal, did you just attempt to justify harassment and intimidation as policy discussion? Because if that's the level of intellectual rigor you bring to policy analysis, I would suggest that you are not qualified to have opinions on military integration." The systematic humiliation of the harassers was being witnessed by dozens of their peers, ensuring that their reputations would be permanently damaged regardless of any formal disciplinary action. Morrison's public destruction of their credibility was far more devastating than any administrative punishment could have been. Morrison stepped back slightly and addressed the group as a whole. "Gentlemen, you have 2 choices. You can immediately apologize to Sergeant Rodriguez for your unprofessional behavior and Commit to treating her with the respect that every service member deserves. Or you can continue down your current path and deal with the consequences that will inevitably follow. The threat was clear, though Morrison had been careful not to specify exactly what those consequences might be. His reputation suggested that he had the connections and influence to make life very difficult for anyone who chose to continue harassing personnel under his protection. Matthews, finally, recognizing the complete hopelessness of his position, looked around at his companions and saw his own fear reflected in their faces. The situation had spiraled completely out of their control, and continuing to resist would only make their eventual punishment more severe. "Master Chief," Matthews said quietly, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "We apologize to Sergeant Rodriguez. Our behavior was inappropriate and unprofessional." Morrison's expression remained cold and unforgiving. "That's a start, Sergeant. Now I suggest that you and your companions return to your table, finish your meals quickly, and spend some time thinking about what it means to serve with honor." As the group of harassers began to disperse, Morrison turned back to Maria with a completely different expression. The cold authority was gone, replaced by genuine respect and concern for a fellow professional who had been unfairly targeted. As Matthews and his companions retreated to their table with their tails between their legs, the atmosphere in the mess hall began to shift dramatically. The tension that had gripped the room during the confrontation slowly gave way to a buzz of whispered conversations and sideways glances at the two figures still standing near Maria's table. Master Chief Morrison remained beside Maria, his commanding presence ensuring that no one else would dare to approach or interfere with their conversation. Morrison pulled out the chair across from Maria and sat down, his movement fluid and controlled despite his obvious authority over the situation. When he spoke, his voice had transformed completely from the cold steel he had used with the harassers to something warm and genuinely concerned. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Morrison began, his eyes meeting hers with sincere respect. "I want to apologize that you had to endure that kind of treatment for even one moment, let alone weeks. No service member should ever have to face harassment for doing their job with competence and dedication." Maria felt a mixture of relief and gratitude washing over her as she realized that this legendary figure not only understood her situation but genuinely cared about addressing it. After weeks of feeling isolated and unsupported, having someone of Morrison's stature acknowledge the wrongness of what she had experienced felt like validation of everything she had been trying to prove. "Thank you, Master Chief," Maria replied, her voice stronger now than it had been since the confrontation began. "I've been trying to handle it on my own, but it was getting harder to ignore." Morrison nodded understanding. "That's one of the problems with this kind of harassment. It's designed to isolate the target and make them feel like they have to face it alone. But you're not alone, Sergeant. There are many of us who recognize good soldiers when we see them, regardless of gender." The Master Chief paused for a moment, seeming to consider his next words carefully. When he continued, his voice carried the weight of personal experience and hard-earned wisdom. "I've served with female personnel in some of the most dangerous and demanding situations the military can offer," Morrison said quietly. "Some of the bravest, most competent operators I've ever worked with have been women. Anyone who questions that hasn't been paying attention to what's actually happening in the field." Maria felt tears threatening to form in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally hearing someone acknowledge her worth and capabilities. After weeks of having her competence questioned and her achievements dismissed, Morrison's words carried enormous emotional impact. "I heard about your work in Afghanistan," Morrison continued, his voice taking on a note of professional admiration. "The communications coordination during Operation Desert Thunder saved a lot of lives, including some friends of mine. That kind of performance under pressure is what separates real professionals from people just wearing the uniform." The fact that Morrison not only knew about her service but understood its significance was almost overwhelming for Maria. She had begun to wonder if anyone in authority positions was aware of the harassment she was facing or cared enough to intervene. Morrison's knowledge of her record proved that good work was noticed, even when it seemed invisible to those around her. "Master Chief," Maria said carefully, "may I ask how you knew about my service in Afghanistan?" Morrison smiled slightly, the first hint of warmth she had seen in his expression since he had approached her table. The special operations community is smaller than most people realize, Sergeant. When someone does exceptional work that affects our missions, word gets around. Your reputation among the people who matter is excellent. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of another figure, this one wearing the insignia of a base commander. Colonel Sarah Mitchell was a career officer with a reputation for running a tight ship and maintaining high standards throughout her command. Her presence at this moment suggested that word of the confrontation had already begun to spread through the base's command structure. Master Chief Morrison, Colonel Mitchell said as she approached their table. I heard there was some kind of incident in the mess hall. Is everything under control? Morrison stood immediately, his years of military protocol taking over despite the informal nature of their previous conversation. Yes, ma'am. We had a situation involving harassment of one of your personnel, but it's been addressed. Colonel Mitchell's expression darkened as she processed Morrison's words. She had worked hard to create an environment where all personnel could serve effectively regardless of gender, and harassment incidents were something she took extremely seriously. Harassment? She asked, her voice carrying the sharp edge that subordinates had learned to fear. Who was involved? Morrison glanced at Maria, giving her the opportunity to speak for herself if she chose. Maria stood as well, recognizing that this moment might be crucial for how the situation was ultimately resolved. Ma'am, Maria began, her military bearing evident in her posture and delivery. Sergeant First Class Matthews and other soldiers have been engaging in ongoing harassment related to my recent promotion and their views on women in combat roles. Colonel Mitchell's jaw tightened visibly as she absorbed this information. She had specifically chosen to create a zero-tolerance policy for harassment because she knew that left unchecked, such behavior could destroy unit cohesion and drive away talented personnel. How long has this been going on, Sergeant? The colonel asked. Several weeks, ma'am. Tonight was the most aggressive incident, but there have been ongoing comments and intimidation tactics. Colonel Mitchell turned to Morrison with an expression of gratitude mixed with frustration. Master Chief, thank you for intervening. I assume you witnessed tonight's incident. Yes, ma'am. 5 soldiers surrounding Sergeant Rodriguez during her meal, making threatening comments and deliberately spilling liquid on her uniform. The behavior was clearly intended to intimidate and humiliate. The colonel's expression grew even more serious as she understood the full scope of what had occurred. Sergeant Rodriguez, why didn't you report this harassment through official channels? Maria felt a moment of anxiety as she considered how to answer the question honestly without seeming to criticize the command structure. Ma'am, I was hoping the situation would resolve itself as the soldiers became more accustomed to working with female personnel. I also wanted to prove that I could handle challenges without requiring special protection. Morrison spoke up before the colonel could respond. Ma'am, if I may, that's exactly the kind of response I would expect from a professional soldier. Sergeant Rodriguez was trying to handle the situation with dignity while continuing to perform her duties. The fault lies entirely with the harassers, not with her response to their behavior. Colonel Mitchell nodded appreciatively at Morrison's assessment. You're absolutely right, Master Chief. No soldier should have to endure harassment, and attempting to handle it professionally doesn't make them responsible for the behavior of others. The colonel turned back to Maria with an expression that mixed authority with genuine concern. Sergeant Rodriguez, I want you to know that harassment of any kind is completely unacceptable in my command. This situation will be investigated thoroughly, and appropriate disciplinary action will be taken against everyone involved. Maria felt another wave of relief as she realized that the intervention had not only stopped the immediate harassment, but had also brought the attention of command personnel who were clearly committed to addressing the problem comprehensively. Thank you, ma'am, Maria replied. I appreciate your support. Morrison interjected with another important point. Colonel, I think it's also important to note that this incident took place in front of dozens of witnesses. The harassment was public and deliberate, which suggests a level of confidence that such behavior would be tolerated or ignored. The implication of Morrison's observation was clear to Colonel Mitchell. If soldiers felt comfortable engaging in public harassment, it suggested that the command climate might not be as clearly communicated as she had believed. That's an excellent point, Master Chief, the colonel replied grimly. It sounds like we need to have some very clear discussions about expectations and consequences throughout the command. Morrison nodded agreement. Ma'am, in my experience, these kinds of incidents rarely occur in isolation. There may be other personnel facing similar challenges who haven't felt comfortable reporting them. Colonel Mitchell's expression showed that she was already thinking through the broader implications of what had been revealed. I'll be conducting a comprehensive review of our command climate and speaking with all female personnel to ensure they feel supported and protected. As the conversation continued, Maria began to realize that what had started as a humiliating confrontation was potentially becoming a catalyst for positive change throughout the base. The intervention of Master Chief Morrison had not only protected her but had also elevated the issue to the attention of command personnel who had the authority to address it systematically. Morrison turned back to Maria with a more personal expression. Sergeant, I want you to know that you have allies throughout the military, even when it might not always feel that way. Good soldiers recognize other good soldiers, regardless of gender or branch of service. The Master Chief's words carried weight beyond their immediate meaning. Maria understood that she was being offered not just support for this specific incident, but ongoing mentorship and protection from someone whose reputation and connections could open doors throughout her military career. Master Chief, Maria said quietly, I can't thank you enough for stepping in tonight. I'm not sure how the situation would have ended without your intervention. Morrison's expression grew serious as he considered her words. Sergeant, you were handling yourself with dignity and professionalism under extremely difficult circumstances. My intervention may have accelerated the resolution, but you were never in as much danger as those 5 soldiers thought you were. The comment sparked Maria's curiosity, and she looked at Morrison with questioning eyes. The Master Chief seemed to read her expression and smiled slightly. Sergeant, I've seen your combat record and your martial arts training scores. Those 5 soldiers had no idea that they were surrounding someone who could probably take them all in a fair fight. Your restraint and professionalism in not responding with force shows exactly the kind of judgment we want in our NCOs. Maria felt a surge of pride at Morrison's assessment of her capabilities and restraint. It was clear that he understood not just her technical qualifications, but also the character traits that made her an effective leader and soldier. Colonel Mitchell had been listening to this exchange with growing respect for both individuals. Master Chief, Sergeant Rodriguez, would you both be available tomorrow morning for a more detailed discussion about tonight's events and our plans for addressing them? Both soldiers agreed immediately, understanding that the formal follow-up would be crucial for ensuring that appropriate action was taken and that similar incidents were prevented in the future. As the conversation began to wind down, Morrison turned to Maria with one final piece of advice. Sergeant, remember that your value as a soldier isn't determined by the opinions of people who lack the courage and competence to earn what you've achieved through merit. Focus on continuing to excel at your job, and let your performance speak for itself. The wisdom in Morrison's words resonated deeply with Maria, who realized that she had been allowing the harassment to affect her confidence and self-perception. The reminder to focus on excellence rather than the opinions of inadequate peers was exactly what she needed to hear. As the 3 military professionals prepared to part ways, Maria felt a transformation beginning within herself. The fear and isolation that had been building over weeks of harassment were being replaced by a renewed sense of confidence and belonging. She had allies, she had support, and, most importantly, she had been reminded of her own worth and capabilities. The mess hall around them had gradually returned to normal activity, though Maria noticed that many of the other diners were still glancing in their direction with expressions of curiosity and respect. Word of what had transpired would spread throughout the base within hours, fundamentally changing how she was perceived by her peers. 3 months after the dramatic confrontation in the mess hall, the atmosphere throughout the base had undergone a remarkable transformation. The incident involving Maria Rodriguez and Master Chief Morrison had become a catalyst for comprehensive changes in policies, procedures, and, most importantly, in the culture that governed daily interactions among personnel. What had begun as one woman's struggle against harassment had evolved into a base-wide recommitment to the principles of mutual respect and professional excellence. Colonel Mitchell had moved swiftly and decisively in the aftermath of that evening's events. Within 48 hours of Morrison's intervention, she had initiated a comprehensive investigation that revealed the harassment Maria experienced was indeed part of a broader pattern of inappropriate behavior affecting multiple female personnel. The investigation uncovered a network of informal intimidation that had been allowed to persist due to a combination of unreported incidents and inadequate oversight. Matthews and his companions faced severe disciplinary action that included formal reprimands, reduction in rank, mandatory sensitivity training, and transfers to different units. More significantly, their behavior had been documented in their permanent service records, effectively ending any prospects for career advancement. The message sent throughout the base was unmistakable. Harassment would not be tolerated, and those who engaged in such behavior would face consequences that extended far beyond temporary punishment. Master Chief Morrison had become an unexpected but powerful advocate for change throughout the base. His reputation and influence had opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed, and his vocal support for zero-tolerance policies carried weight with personnel who might have been resistant to such changes coming from other sources. Morrison's involvement had transformed what could have been seen as political correctness into a matter of military professionalism and operational effectiveness. For Maria, the months following the incident had brought opportunities and recognition that exceeded her highest expectations. Word of her grace under pressure and Morrison's public validation of her competence had spread throughout the special operations community, leading to offers for advanced training and specialized assignments that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. The transformation in her daily experience was equally dramatic. The whispered comments and hostile stares had been replaced by respectful greetings and genuine collaboration. Other female personnel began seeking her out for advice and mentorship, recognizing that she had successfully navigated challenges they were still facing. Maria found herself becoming a role model and advocate, a position she embraced with the same dedication she had brought to every other aspect of her military service. Morrison had continued to serve as an informal mentor, meeting with Maria regularly to discuss career development, leadership challenges, and the broader issues facing women in combat roles. Their conversations had evolved from crisis intervention to strategic career planning, with Morrison sharing insights gained from his decades of experience in elite military units. During one such meeting in Morrison's office, the Master Chief shared observations that had helped Maria understand the broader significance of what had occurred that evening in the mess hall. Sergeant Rodriguez, Morrison had said during a particularly meaningful conversation, what happened that night wasn't really about you personally, although you bore the brunt of it. It was about fear of change, insecurity about traditional roles, and the difficulty some people have adapting to new realities. Maria had come to understand that her harassment had been symptomatic of larger tensions within the military as it adapted to increasing integration and evolving roles for women in combat positions. Her successful navigation of those challenges had made her a symbol of the possibilities that opened when competence and character were valued over traditional prejudices. The investigation had also revealed something unexpected and troubling. Several male soldiers had approached Colonel Mitchell privately to report their own discomfort with the harassment they had witnessed, but felt unable to address. These revelations had prompted additional discussions about bystander responsibility and the creation of mechanisms for reporting inappropriate behavior even when one was not the direct target. Morrison had been particularly interested in this aspect of the situation. One of the most damaging effects of harassment, he had explained to Maria, is that it creates an environment where good people feel helpless to intervene. When we change that dynamic, we strengthen the entire unit. The changes implemented at the base had attracted attention from higher command levels, with several senior officers visiting to observe and potentially replicate successful policies at their own installations. Maria found herself occasionally called upon to brief visiting dignitaries about her experiences and the positive changes that had resulted from addressing harassment directly and comprehensively. These speaking opportunities had revealed another of Maria's talents that had previously gone unrecognized. Her ability to articulate complex issues clearly and professionally had impressed senior officers who began considering her for positions requiring communication and liaison responsibilities. Morrison had encouraged her to develop these skills further, suggesting that her unique perspective and proven resilience made her particularly valuable for roles involving policy development and implementation. The ripple effects of that evening continued to expand in unexpected ways. A documentary film crew had contacted the base requesting permission to tell Maria's story as part of a larger project about women in combat roles. While Maria had initially been reluctant to participate, Morrison had encouraged her to consider the broader impact her story might have on female service members throughout the military. Your story isn't just about overcoming harassment, Morrison had pointed out during their discussion about the documentary. It's about proving that excellence will ultimately be recognized and rewarded, even in the face of significant obstacles. That's a message that could inspire countless other service members who are facing their own challenges. The base had also become something of a model for other installations struggling with similar issues. Colonel Mitchell had been invited to speak at conferences and training seminars about the comprehensive approach they had developed for addressing harassment and creating inclusive environments. The success of their initiatives had begun influencing military policy at levels far above a single base command. Maria's personal relationship with Morrison had evolved into something approaching friendship, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to military excellence. Their regular conversations had become one of the highlights of her service experience, providing insights and perspectives that she knew would benefit her throughout her career. Morrison had also introduced Maria to a network of senior female officers and NCOs who provided additional mentorship and career guidance. These connections had opened her eyes to possibilities for advancement and specialization that she had never previously considered. The isolation and self-doubt that had characterized her experience before the incident had been completely replaced by a sense of belonging to a community of professionals who valued her contributions. The transformation in her relationship with other personnel on the base had been equally dramatic. Soldiers who had previously treated her with indifference or hostility now sought her input on professional matters and included her in informal social activities. The respect she had earned through her handling of the harassment situation had enhanced her credibility on all other matters. Perhaps most significantly, Maria had begun to see herself differently. The confidence that had been eroded by weeks of harassment had been restored and strengthened by the experience of overcoming adversity with dignity and receiving recognition from respected professionals. She no longer questioned whether she belonged in the military or whether her achievements were legitimate. The final conversation between Maria and Morrison before he transferred to his next assignment had been particularly meaningful for both of them. Morrison had been characteristically direct in his assessment of what had been accomplished. "Sergeant Rodriguez," he had said, "you should understand that what happened here will continue to have positive effects long after both of us have moved on to other assignments. You've helped change the culture of this installation in ways that will benefit every service member who serves here in the future." Maria had expressed her gratitude for Morrison's intervention and ongoing mentorship, but the Master Chief had deflected her thanks with typical humility. "Sergeant, I may have accelerated the resolution of your immediate problem, but everything that followed came from your own character and competence. The recognition you've received, the opportunities that have opened up, the respect you've earned, all of that came from your own merit and professionalism." The conversation had concluded with Morrison offering Maria a piece of advice that would guide her throughout the remainder of her military career and beyond. "Remember that true leadership isn't about commanding others," Morrison had said. "It's about setting an example that inspires others to be better than they thought they could be. You've already begun doing that, and I have no doubt you'll continue making that kind of impact wherever your career takes you." As Maria reflected on the extraordinary journey from that terrible evening in the mess hall to her current position as a respected leader and role model, she understood that the incident had been a defining moment not just for her personally, but for everyone who had witnessed it or been affected by its aftermath. The harassment she had endured had been painful and demoralizing, but her response to it and Morrison's intervention had created opportunities for positive change that extended far beyond her individual situation. The base was now a better place for all personnel, male and female, because the confrontation had forced a reckoning with attitudes and behaviors that had previously been tolerated or ignored. Looking toward the future, Maria felt a sense of optimism and purpose that would have been unimaginable during those dark weeks before Morrison's intervention. She had proven to herself and others that excellence and character would ultimately prevail over prejudice and harassment. More importantly, she had become part of a positive transformation that would continue benefiting others long after she had moved on to new challenges and opportunities. The story that had begun with one woman standing alone against harassment had evolved into a testament to the power of intervention, the importance of allies, and the possibility of creating positive change even in the most challenging circumstances. It had become a story not just of survival, but of triumph, growth, and the kind of leadership that inspires others to reach their own highest potential. Master Chief Morrison's legacy at the base would be remembered not just for his operational achievements, but for his demonstration that true strength comes from protecting those who need protection and standing up for what is right regardless of personal cost. His intervention had shown that leadership is ultimately about service to others and the courage to act when action is needed most. The mess hall where it all began had returned to its normal function as a place where service members gathered for meals and informal interaction. But those who had witnessed the confrontation would never forget the lesson it had taught about courage, dignity, and the power of intervention when faced with injustice. The fluorescent lights still buzzed overhead, but they now illuminated a space where all personnel could eat in peace, knowing they were protected by policies and a culture that valued every individual's contribution to their shared mission.